Hey, Dad.
What?
Why wouldn't the Pharaoh let the Hebrews go?
'Cause they were his slaves?
Because he was in denial.
No, I'm not giving you that one.
Cries.
You're listening to The Wayward Willis with Jon and Logan, where two atheists discuss religion, culture, and maybe some politics. If you're offended by blasphemy, profanity, or you hate fun, this podcast may not be right for you. And now, on to the show.
Hey, you.
It's us.
And you haven't changed one bit.
I have. I'm your host, Jon.
And I'm Logan, the disappointment.
And this week we're going to needlessly capitalize a word. We're talking about truth.
So, what even is truth?
Well, the dictionary defines truth as that which comports with reality and facts. We generally measure truth by comparing it to what we already know about the world and how well it fits into the model of reality. We want truth to be as objective as possible. That is, independent of personal experience or feeling, the truth is still true. If a tree falls in the woods and nobody sees it, it's still true that the tree fell. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about a fallen tree. And if the tree couldn't stand up on its own, maybe it deserves to be a log.
Hey, that's just rude. You don't know that tree's life story? Were you presuming to know anything about that tree? What's wrong with you?
Well, I'm not saying that I don't like trees. I'm just saying logs are also trees.
I think it sounds like you're just a big old tree hater.
I'm not hating on trees.
Don't hate the tree.
It's just dumb. As I mentioned before, people with a God belief usually capitalize the T in truth and turn it into something different. A capital T truth essentially means whatever God says. More appropriately, it means whatever I was told by a guy who isn't God, who read a book written by men, who selected portions a long time ago to be considered canon for what I believe. Essentially, the statement, I know there is a God, is subjective even though it's proposed as capital T truth. Here's why these truth statements suck. Capital T truth stifles inquiry. For example, Galileo championed the heliocentric model and opened the door to all kinds of future science. Imagine if the Roman Catholic Church's charge of heresy scared other astronomers enough to where they just avoided the question altogether and accepted the Church's truth that God put the Earth at the center of the universe.
Yeah, honestly, that point is a little bit frightening to me because I know that in the past could have been a very real thing that happened. Like the church with its stranglehold on society in general could have basically just like forced the scientists in the community to not really do what they were doing. And we could be in a very, very different place today when it comes to that.
Yeah, and when you think about it, the prospect of that really isn't all that far off because the church not only controlled what they considered truth, but they also considered funding for almost everything from arts to science to medicine, and they did exert a lot of control in those areas. Let's also consider the Mormon Church's truth about the inferiority of dark-skinned people, which not only prohibited Mormons from questioning the racism of the doctrine itself, but caused the church to actively oppose the civil rights movement all the way up until 1978.
Yeah, that's pretty messed up. I don't actually know much about the teachings of the Mormon Church, obviously, but I kind of get the gist of this.
Yeah, and this doctrine that finally ended in 1978 actually included bans on interracial marriage.
I could see that, which is unfortunate and silly, but I mean, not entirely surprising.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a way that these large religious organized belief systems can keep people from asking honest questions and seeking honest answers in the hope that the capital T truth of that church remains what everyone considers truth.
Yeah, and I guess if you're sitting in a position of power like that, in one of these really big churches and you're to be insensitive here feeding people a bunch of bullshit, like you don't want them to just like dismiss it. And I guess no matter how small what you're doing is, if there's any way to sort of hold more power over somebody, any amount of power whatsoever, then it's definitely going to help your cause.
Definitely. So another way on a more personal level that capital T truth hurts is that it ends conversations. If I'm having a conversation with a believer and I refuse to accept their personal experience, which is subjective, as justification for their beliefs, they'll often want to just end the conversation altogether. A lot of times this comes down to a let's just agree to disagree. But a lot of times they will use the capital T truth as in, well, that's just what I know is true.
I actually have quite a bit of experience with this, specifically with people that were like very, very avidly religious. Like anytime that any sort of conversation about religion would be happening at all, they would be like either super salty about it or whatever, and usually end up trying to cut the conversation short just by being like, oh, well, that's just how it is.
Well, and don't you think it's funny that a lot of times when you're in that situation, you're not having that conversation because you asked what they believed, they just offered it up voluntarily, and then the conversation starts going downhill, and then all of a sudden they're not quite as interested in talking about it anymore.
Yeah, well, and that's usually how it goes. Like, I would be talking to somebody completely different about religion or about one particular excerpt of the Bible or something like that, and somebody who was very strongly religious would find a way to muscle their way into the conversation and then end it when it didn't go their way.
Right. Well, and a lot of times this happens either because they know that they'll never give you a satisfactory answer, or because they identify too strongly with their belief and they view your questions or your skepticism as an attack on who they are at their core.
Well, and even, I kind of briefly mentioned this in one of our earlier episodes, but my Spanish teacher, who was like, because God wanted it that way, like, that doesn't help me at all. As a student trying to learn more about the Spanish language, you telling me that the Spanish language has certain quirks because that's how God wanted it doesn't help me learn anything about the Spanish language. Like,
yeah, that's just a complete lack of curiosity.
If there's a particular conjugation that falls outside of the regular bounds of how the Spanish language normally operates, there's probably a reason for it, and that reason is probably not because God wanted it that way. It's probably got some sort of significant meaning, but, you know, it is what it is.
I feel like if God were in charge of language, that more than one moose would definitely be meese.
I don't necessarily hate that, though. So, I mean, if that's how he wants it, then more power to him.
Well, from now on, I'm calling it meese.
Well, I'm calling you an idiot then.
That wouldn't be the first time.
Roasted yourself, I think.
So capital T truth can also lead to the spread of misinformation. For example, and this is completely hypothetical.
Fake
just
news.
follow me
News.
down this rabbit hole. If, let's say, someone believed that, let's say, the president of the United States was not a natural-born citizen, and they just knew it was true, they might be tempted to publicly state that and get other people who buy into capital T truths to publicly state it. If that were to happen, I'm not saying that it ever would, but if it were to happen...
Purely hypothetical here.
Purely hypothetical. People all over the country might actually start to think it really was true and become distracted from the really important things. But just luckily, nobody would do that. And if they did, there's no way they would be rewarded for it.
Oh, absolutely not.
That just doesn't happen.
Silly non-hypotheticals aside, this actually kind of correlates to what we were talking about in our last episode too, with specifically like Bigfoot or fucking the Loch Ness Monster, like those kinds of silly things. Like, it doesn't really take much to get gullible people to buy into something that might sound nonsensical, but specifically things that don't necessarily sound completely out of the realm of possibility. And once you get enough people believing in something that you believe in as a capital T truth, it really doesn't take much to get that to spread like a freaking virus.
Yeah, it really doesn't. And I think that one of the things about like the Loch Ness Monster or Sasquatch is that those types of things spread more readily when you provide some sort of tangible, let's call it evidence, but I kind of want to put that in quotes. But, you know, if you have a picture or a video that you can show to somebody and they're already kind of like wanting something special, you know, wanting there to be something special about the world anyway, then, you know, showing them, giving them just a little morsel is just going to fuel that fire.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, as in this last example, often the capital T truth is contradicted when it's later retracted. So, in addition to, you know, like, let's say that somebody did produce a birth certificate and then, like, finally they're like, fine, whatever, and dropped it.
Yeah,
like,
purely
if that were to ever happen. But also, in the case of the Mormon Church's racism, that was retracted in 1978. But even then, it was positioned as just a new capital T truth revealed to the prophet by God himself, and it just coincidentally followed the successes of the civil rights movement. I mean, you'd think that if God were revealing truth to prophets, he'd be able to preempt violence and oppression and just save us all a ton of time.
Well, maybe he just changed his mind, all right?
God's not supposed to change his mind. I mean, he's supposed to be the perfect being. So why would the perfect being get something wrong and then have to correct it?
Well, Emma Watson sometimes changes her mind too, all right? And if anything is close to the perfect being, it's Emma Watson.
Touché. Regardless, if these are supposed to be objective truths, then we should at least expect them to be consistent.
Amen.
I'm going to let Logan go now and bring him back after the interview segment. And that is the truth. Because we're talking about truth this week, we're going to be talking about accountability as well. I'd like to introduce my guest, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. He's heading up the Pro-Truth Pledge, which is getting a lot more recognition online and is part of a larger project called Intentional Insights. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, it's part of the larger program, and Intentional Insights is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan nonprofit. The Pro-Truth Pledge is a program of Intentional Insights. I'm the volunteer president of Intentional Insights. I've been the president for the last 3 years, one of the co-founders, and I co-founded it with my wife about 3 years ago. And the goal of Intentional Insights is to promote rational thinking and orientation toward truth and wise decision-making in all life areas. So that's what Intentional Insights does as a whole. The Pro-Truth Pledge is the focus of Intentional Insights within the political sphere, kind of promoting rational thinking and wise decision-making in politics. And we've been focusing most of our energy on this project for the last couple of years because we feel it is the area in most need of wise decision-making and rational thinking.
Good. And I have only recently heard of this, just within the past few months. It seems like the word has been getting out a lot more effectively. And as soon as I heard about this, I was actually pretty excited about it because I thought that we needed kind of an agreement, kind of a social agreement where we can recognize that there is a problem and we can kind of hold each other responsible and accountable for fixing that problem.
Yes, and that is definitely one of the aspects of the Pro-Truth Pledge. So you have a lot of initiative in that you kind of recognize it, and you immediately went and said, "Hey, this is a good idea. I'll go and sign up."
Yes.
And other people often don't have as much initiative. They say, "Well, hey, this sounds like a good idea. Let me see how it goes." But if people don't take the initiative to go and sign up, it won't go anywhere.
Right.
It only takes 2 minutes to go to protruthpledge.org and sign up. Just 2 minutes of time to cast your vote for truth in politics instead of deceptions.
Yes, and it honestly is the least you could do. In signing the pledge, again, it takes no effort whatsoever. But then you're committing after that to be sort of a community of concern that is targeted toward holding each other accountable and making sure that the amount of disinformation that's spreading through public channels is pointed out, is corrected, and retracted where necessary.
Absolutely. So the Pro-Truth Pledge is composed of 12 behaviors that anyone who signs the pledge commits to. And I'll read a few of them. You kind of summarize them well, but just so folks get the flavor. And I recommend anyone who's listening to just go to protruthpledge.org and check it out as we go along this show. So the first behavior is fact-check information to confirm it's true before accepting and sharing it. Another behavior is reevaluate if my information is challenged and retract it if I can't verify it. Another is ask people to retract information if reliable sources have disproved, even if those people are my allies. And a fourth behavior is celebrate those who retract incorrect statements and update their beliefs toward the truth. And there are 8 more. Now, wouldn't our society be so much better off if everyone, ordinary citizens and public figures, especially politicians, took and abided by the Pro-Truth Pledge? That's kind of what we're trying to accomplish. And by getting as many people as possible to sign up, that's what we're going to achieve.
Yes.
getting other people to sign up.
Absolutely. And I do think that it's very important. And the reason that I asked you on here is because after having signed the pledge and I'm hoping to become a very, active and meaningful part of it, but I feel like anybody else who may not have heard about it or who just doesn't understand how important it is to other people can, hear it from different channels and learn about it and maybe hop on board as well.
Yes, absolutely. So it takes a lot of exposure to a new thing for people to actually take on the new thing. I hear from people all the time that, hey, Gleb, I heard you on, 5 podcasts, and now I decided to go and actually check out this Pro Truth Pledge thing, and oh well, it's a great idea. Let me sign up.
Yes.
So it takes a lot of exposure, and people need a lot of exposure to something new in order to become more comfortable with it and sign up. So yes, an approach of pledge, a lot of people, when they first hear about it, they say, well, why should, public figures sign up? And for people who are on the website right now, they can click on that Take the Pledge orange button in the top right, and they can see some of the reasons that public figures would sign up, as well as what they would do. So what you would do if you're signing up is you put in your first name, your last name, your email. You can choose to opt out of emails. Then your phone number and address, and that's important so that we can go to your elected representatives. You don't have to put those in, but those are important to put in because then we can go to your elected representatives and say, hey, these are people in your district who wanted you to sign the Pro Truth Pledge. And you can leave the box checked that says, I call on all of my elected representatives to take the Pro Truth Pledge. That's the function of the Pro Truth Pledge in that regard as a petition.
And yes, and that's important because, first of all, a lot of people don't even know who the representatives are. And second of all, a lot of times if you do reach out to your representatives, there's no guarantee that they're going to see what you're sending them. And I've kind of been bugging my representatives and my senators with, Pro Truth Pledge tags and hoping that they're going to see them. I guess that brings me to one of my questions is...
Sure.
How do we know if our representatives, aside from, maybe potentially seeing retweets or shares once they've signed it, how would we find out if our representatives have signed the Pro Truth Pledge?
There's a public figures page, which is, we're still building it up, but it's already available. Whereas for people who signed the Pro Truth Pledge, it's available in their newsletters and indicates to them whether their public representatives have signed the Pro Truth Pledge. So that's available. That's public information that's out there. We just wanted to finish it up before putting it on the main website to make it look a little bit nicer. But it's available to, like I said, people who already signed the Pro Truth Pledge. So the goal of that is to go to your elected representatives. You can know whether they saw it by knowing that, hey, you received the confirmation email, or at least that their staff saw it. Now, you can always escalate your activities from tweeting to emailing to calling, then to visiting their office, and we've done that. So for people who we want to make sure we went to them before their office, before saying that they chose not to take the Pro Truth Pledge, to make sure that they had this opportunity for the Pro Truth Pledge to be exposed to them in their office in this personal contact. So, for example, we had here in the congressional race in District 12 of Ohio, where I live, we have 5 candidates, 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. And one of the Republicans took the Pro Truth Pledge. The other one said that he will very likely will once I sit down with him and talk about it thoroughly. So that's pretty much 2. And the 2 Democrats have taken the Pro Truth Pledge. And so 1 Republican remains who hasn't taken the Pro Truth Pledge. So this is now that we know, and we've gone to that Republican's office, we've offered him the opportunity to chat and say, hey, here's the Pro Truth Pledge. Now that he has indicated that he hasn't chosen to take the Pro Truth Pledge, we'll be going to the newspapers and saying, hey, so here we have this local race for Congress, and 4 out of 5 candidates have committed to the Pro Truth Pledge, and 1 didn't. Do you want to write a story about this?
Okay.
So this is, we don't want to do that until we've made sure to go to somebody's office and give them the opportunity to consider it and make sure they saw it.
Right, because the goal of this is not to bully or shame anybody, but it's just to try and encourage participation and to make a public acknowledgement that the spread of disinformation is in fact a problem and that you will not be a part of that.
Yes, and absolutely. The goal of the project is not to shame or bully anyone. In providing information to the newspaper about this, we are rewarding the people who, and one of the goals is to reward people who took the pro-truth pledge. So we are rewarding those people by giving them media attention, media exposure. And we have a number of media figures who have taken the pro-truth pledge and who are enthusiastic about it and who are happy to give media exposure to people who have taken the pro-truth pledge, people who are public figures.
Good.
That's one of the aspirations. And so this is kind of getting back to why would public figures take the pro-truth pledge. So if you're still on the website, you can see that for public figures, they can give their logo or other image, photograph, and that's for of public figures and organizations. So we have a number of organizations that are committed to the pro-truth pledge as a whole. So organizations or public figures. And then they get to give a paragraph about why they chose to take the pro-truth pledge and 3 links to their whatever chosen venues that they want to disseminate to all the people who took the pro-truth pledge and who signed up for the newsletter, which is why it's so important to sign up for the newsletter, and also on the public figures page, which any media figure can access. And as I said, we have a number of media figures who took the pro-truth pledge and who are enthusiastic about it. So these are the people who will then get positive reputation, recognition from taking the pro-truth pledge. They can also put a pro-truth pledge badge on their website. And this is accessible for anyone, whether they consider themselves a public figure or not. They can put that badge on their website saying they took the pro-truth pledge. They can put a Twibbon on their Twitter feed, Facebook frame on their Facebook. They can put a link to their LinkedIn saying that they took the pro-truth pledge, and they can put it on the back of their business cards. So that's kind of for ordinary people and for public figures alike to improve their reputation and give them the rewards they deserve for publicly committing to orient toward the truth.
Excellent. And I guess I can just point out at this time that our website, willisweb.com, does have the Pro-Truth badge on it, and I have it featured prominently on our Patreon profile.
Excellent.
Now, what I wanted to do was I wanted to take just a second to kind of get into definitions. So there's a lot of mention of a post-truth era and post-truth politics. Can you just describe what you would say post-truth means?
Sure. So Oxford Dictionary chose post-truth as its word of the year in 2016, referring to post-truth politics. And it defined the word as referring to a situation where appeals to personal beliefs, regardless of how the factual they are, and emotions win out over appeals to objective facts. So that's simply what it means, in colloquial language, appeals to lies and emotionals and, appeals to the gut, winning out over truth and reason. So that's what post-truth means.
Okay. Is there the inverse? Is there post-lies?
Well, I used that term in an article I wrote, but really what I'm aiming for is to create a pro-truth movement. And hopefully that's going to be the inverse of post-truth, pro-truth. So that's essentially a situation where people get rewarded for telling the truth and they get penalized for lying. Unfortunately, in our current society, that's not what happens.
Correct.
People who tell the truth, we can't really distinguish them from the liars, and so we don't reward them. And people who lie because they can lie, they have a much larger range of options and techniques and tools to get what they want. And because they're not penalized for lying, they just can lie away. And, it's like the saying that I think is attributed to Mark Twain, but I think it was originally from Jonathan Swift, that a lie travels around the world before truth has time to get its shoes on.
Right.
So similar, it was the case way back when, but even more so now, in large part due to social media, because we don't have the traditional filters of newspapers, editors, and TV editors who would edit out the lies spewing from social media. And so that's a big, big problem that is causing a large part of our current post-truth moment.
Right. And it's important to point out that Intentional Insights in the Pro-Truth Pledge is nonpartisan. That its goal is to completely stay out of partisan politics and just stick to the important issue of telling the truth and weeding out the lies.
This is, what I was saying, very happy when Republicans take it. We're very happy when Democrats take it. You can talk about any division. We're very happy when religious people take it, when secular people take it, when scientists take it, when lay people take it, whatever the opposite is. So we're very happy when everyone takes it, because we know those people are going to be oriented toward the truth. And if they're public figures, we have a clear accountability mechanism where anyone who chooses to take the pro-truth pledge and be a volunteer can monitor public figures like myself, like John, like anybody else who took the pro-truth pledge and who are public figures. They're going to be evaluated and monitored to make sure they stick to the pledge. And so that is another benefit for public figures like myself and for John and for politicians and, much more prominent people like Steven Pinker and Peter Singer who took the pro-truth pledge, that they get to have the credibility of being monitored by others to ensure that what they say is true, as opposed to just saying, hey, I'm speaking the truth. Well, who are you to say that you're speaking the truth, right?
Right. Well, and that makes perfect sense for public figures. I guess I would like to kind of turn that around and say, what is the benefit and what is the impact of private figures taking the pro-truth pledge?
So private figures have a number of benefits. They have quite a bit more credibility, and they can show that through, again, putting the pro-truth pledge badge on their website, putting the Twibbon frame on their Twibbon, putting the Facebook frame on their Facebook, putting it on their back of their business cards, and we have a special marker for that, wearing T-shirts, and when they post an article, they can say something like, we advise people to actually say something like, hey, P.S., I took the pro-truth pledge. I consider this article credible. I think the title matches the headline. The title matches the content. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And that's a much more credible statement than if you just share an article randomly on Facebook. So you get to have quite a bit more credibility among people you engage with through people knowing that you took the pro-truth pledge. And you also get the benefit of joining a community of people who are oriented toward truth. So we have virtual communities, online communities, and we're developing in-person communities. We have them in some states, and we definitely want to develop them in all states and internationally as well, where people can come together in groups to promote the pro-truth project and just be in community together. I'm much more interested in being in the community with people who are oriented and dedicated toward the truth than people who are not. I can trust my plumber much more if I know that my plumber took the pro-truth pledge, and so on with my lawyer and doctor.
Or your car dealer. Yes.
I'm, my financial advisor, for example, Christian Rudder, he took the pro-truth pledge, and I really appreciate that. Now I don't need to check as much of his work in financial advising, because I know that, I can trust him much more than I would somebody who didn't take the pro-truth pledge. And so that is a certain benefit for people who took the pro-truth pledge for that community. And of course, they get the civic activism benefit of improving the world. The same sort of warm, fuzzy feeling that you get from recycling and from contributing to, if you happen to recycle or contribute to environmental causes or political causes of any sort, that you make a really big difference in this situation. We have right now, we're at the start of the pro-truth movement as a whole. So imagine if you're at the start of the environmental movement in the 1960s. How exciting is that you get to shape something that would have such a large impact down the road? And every minute, every hour that you spend on this movement as a volunteer, every dollar will have much more of an impact if it's small as it is right now than later when it's larger and when more people contribute. So you get to be an early contributor to solving a huge problem in our society.
Right. And that's never a bad thing.
No.
So one question that I want to ask you, and this is kind of throwing maybe a little bit of a wrench in things, but I'm interested in hearing how you would answer it. Because this podcast is mostly opinion based, and the religious content that we have a commentary on is really subject to interpretation. What kind of things in a more opinion-based format, what kind of things should we be looking out for? What should we not do in this context?
Sure. So one of the key behaviors that you should consider is the fourth behavior, distinguish between my opinion and the facts. So clarify. And that's for people who are on the website, they can see that behavior. That's the fourth one down. So we have 12 behaviors. So distinguishing between my opinion and the facts is going to be really crucial. Where's your opinion? Where are the facts? Another aspect of that is to avoid or be very careful about how you distinguish between the opinions of different people and how you characterize them, not to slant their opinions. So, if you say, we recently had a situation where somebody who took the pro-truth pledge was describing someone else's opinion in an unflattering way. It didn't go too far, but it was kind of, hey, this is a warning, kind of, just be careful with descriptions of other people's opinions. Okay. So that's another thing that you want to be careful about, so not to mischaracterize them. So I think those are going to be the big things when you talk about other people's opinions.
All right. Well, I think that that really answered my questions. And again, you can follow the Pro-Truth Pledge. You can sign the Pro-Truth Pledge at protruthpledge.org. And they also have Facebook groups or pages for intentional insights as well as Pro-Truth Pledge. And it's a really good resource. I received the emails. I did not remove myself from the email list. And there's some good information coming through there. And I appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me on, John. This was a pleasure, and I'm really glad that you had a chance, that you gave me a chance to share with folks about this. And I hope everyone just takes 2 minutes to go to protruthpledge.org and sign up and cast their vote for truth in politics as opposed to lies.
I hope so, too. Logan and I spent last weekend in Sunset Hills, Missouri at the Gateway to Reason conference. First, we want to thank Thomas True for what I'm sure was a massive undertaking in putting together a really great event.
Sidebar, was that the guy who was like running the microphone and stuff?
Yes, and it was also his birthday. So happy birthday to Thomas.
Happy belated birthday. We all sang to him at the conference. It was pretty sweet.
Yes, we did. And it actually sounded pretty good.
Yeah, not gonna lie, I've definitely heard worse happy birthday renditions.
I've heard worse in a church congregation.
Oh, roasted, generic blanket roasting to all people in churches.
I don't know that was really a roast.
It is now.
All right. Now, this was Logan's very first conference that he's ever been to on either atheism or skepticism. And we were going to take this segment of the show to just kind of talk about how the conference went and what we learned.
Yeah, so actually I'm pretty new when it comes to the atheist activist community. I've never been to a conference before, but I mean, this podcast is a pretty like daring thing to do right off the bat. But I mean, it's proven to be a pretty decent venture, and I had a lot of fun at the conference actually. I met a lot of super great people and had some really awesome conversations, and I feel pretty confident that we have a bunch of good interviews lined up for our show as well, which is super exciting for me.
Yeah, I really hope we do. It was actually kind of funny to me while we were walking around, and I would look around at the room and be like, oh my gosh, that's what's his face, and oh my gosh, that's that other person, and you were just like, I have no idea who you're talking about.
Well, yeah, and that was the thing, is that so like Seth Andrews, the Thinking Atheist, Matt Dillahunty, like both super big names in the atheist community, and like both times that I talked to them and basically propositioned them for an interview, I was like, so I'm not gonna lie, I have no idea who you are, but it's nice to meet you, and this is what we're all about, and blah blah blah. Gave him the spiel, but yeah, eventually by the end of the conference, I was like Facebook friends with like 3 or 4 different pseudo-celebrities in the atheist community. So I guess it helps to be not super informed about people's celebrity status when you're meeting them for the first time, because you just don't really care as much.
Yeah, I think that maybe it's not one of those situations where you can get kind of turned off because somebody's a huge, squealing fanboy and, like, just stutters over themselves while talking to you because they're just so excited to meet you.
Yeah. Well,
and then here's Logan over here. He's like, hey, dude, I heard that you have, like, a thing or something. Can I sit next to you?
Well, it was funny because by the end of the conference, I had like pseudo celebrities like waving at me from across the room. And I was like, "Oh, this is pretty cool, I guess."
Yeah, that was pretty awesome.
Matt Dillahunty just sat down next to me and started talking about video games with me, which is cool.
Yeah, well, At one point, your little brother was there with us as well, and he went over to Dave Fitzgerald, and Dave turned around and looked at him. He was like, "Oh, hi," and your brother goes, "Hey, is that water in the cooler over there?" I'm just like, yeah, he's just a dude standing there to tell you if there's water there. That's cool.
Oh, it's pretty great. Anyway, yeah, we definitely met a lot of good people. I'd like to personally thank Natalie Noble. She was on the panel with 2 other people. I believe it was talking about atheism or how to talk to atheists or something along those lines. But we actually sat down and we had an incredibly awesome conversation with her. We covered a pretty wide range of topics, and I'm actually super excited to have her on the show and to interview her and just to have some more really engaging conversation.
Yeah, and I'm going to put an invite out to her and see if we can get her on the show. It would be nice to kind of continue the conversation that we had, because I think that what it really came down to was discussing the merits and downfalls of being either a firebrand atheist or just kind of like a friendly atheist, to borrow a term. But I found that I came down on the firebrand side more often than not. And I do know that one of the terms that I have used on this podcast, Natalie just absolutely hates. So we'll have to talk about that sometime.
Yeah, I definitely consider myself more diplomatic when it comes to talking to people about religion. But yeah, she also brought up another good point about people who are spiritual, but not necessarily religious or associated with organized religion per se. And there's actually a very fine distinction that I don't think a whole lot of people understand. And granted, it's a very small cluster of people that I would consider to be along those lines, but it's definitely an interesting conversation that we had with her, and it would be great to continue something along those lines.
So another really cool talk that we saw was Sally Hunt delivering a message about the Thrive program, which is a religious-based sex miseducation curriculum. And she has started a group here in St. Louis to expose this program for what it truly is, and to start communicating with and petitioning school administrators and school boards, getting this religious nonsense out of the schools.
Yeah, and this is something that I wholeheartedly agree with 100%. I think that religion should not be involved in the school's curriculum at all. Like, if you're taking an extracurricular class about religion, that's one thing, but it should not be concrete built into a school's default curriculum. Any required classes you take, it should not be there. And B, I think that in general, abstinence-only sex education is only hurtful for society. I think that it causes way more harm than it does good. These days, younger people are getting involved in sex at a very, very unfortunately young age. And not necessarily having sex, but just it's at the forefront of our society in an unfortunate quantity. And it's a thing that's going to happen. Kids are going to want to experiment, and they're going to want to discover their sexualities younger and younger. And if we're in schools teaching them that the only way to properly approach that is to just not at all, that's only going to be harmful. Kids are going to try and find ways to sneak around that and discover it anyway, or just go about it in the wrong fashion. And if we can instead teach kids on how they can do it safely and without putting themselves or other people at risk, I don't understand why that's a bad thing.
No, I don't either. And having, 2 kids myself and having kind of dealt with this, I mean, if you don't think that your kids are thinking about sex, I mean, the adolescent years are the most difficult times. You're a teenager and you've got these raging hormones. And even if it weren't for underwear ad billboards and internet porn, like, kids would still be thinking about sex. It's just what happens. And so, I think that what really struck me about Sally is just that she's so sex positive and so realistic about the outlook that what she's really pushing for is just a way to skirt this whole shame and dirtiness culture that we've built up. We're very just puritanical when it comes to sex.
Absolutely.
And I think that if we, from very young age, while we're raising our kids if we just made sure that we weren't acting like being naked was somehow wrong, or that, we're pretending that we had kids without having sex just to try and protect them from even thinking that, people have sex. Then, it's just a massive amount of denial on our parts.
Absolutely. And that's not even that only touches the tip of the iceberg, because Sally goes on to talk about the Thrive program itself and just how awful it is in more ways than just the religious aspect of it. It's terrifying. And I sincerely hope that we can get her on the podcast to interview her and have her explain a little more in detail about her cause and what she's trying to accomplish.
Yes, I absolutely want to have her on. And so we're going to try and make that happen real soon.
Another person that we had an incredibly good experience meeting and conversing with is Margaret Downey, and she's actually the founder of the Free Thought Society, and she has led the charge when it comes to activist movements in the atheist community. She's done all sorts of things to help out. Most notably, I would say the Tree of Knowledge, which is essentially it's the atheist Christmas tree, and she's faced a lot of flack for that, but she's also started essentially a whole brand new movement for the atheist community. And that's something that's actively spreading across the country and starting to catch on. And even across the world, she said that there have been a couple of places outside of our country's borders that have taken to it. So, and in general, she's just an all around good, fun person. Like, I could not talk to her without smiling. She's just so kind.
She hugged me. So one other important thing about Margaret Downey is that she founded the Anti-Discrimination Support Network, and this really stemmed out of some bullshit discrimination against atheists with the Boy Scouts of America. And, the Boy Scouts have kind of gotten some press lately.
And not in a good way.
Not in a good way. But, over the years, they've kind of changed and they've got like some local chapters that sort of go against the grain with some of the more detestable national organization rules. But, we still have people that are being discriminated against. And Margaret has really done a lot to kind of involve people and to lead the charge against organizations, not just the BSA, but organizations like that are receiving public funding and still discriminating. She had a lot of good stories to tell, and I enjoyed listening to her talk.
It was just an all-around good experience for me. It's nice to know that there are people who are actually out there doing stuff to help further the cause. I hate to say it like it's like fighting back, like we're at a war with religion. I feel like sometimes it kind of feels that way, but not necessarily. But it's definitely nice to know that there are people that are out there like active in the community, making things happen and raising awareness for us and trying to help accomplish what it is that the atheist community is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and not only that, but when we're talking about the atheist community, we're talking about, to use a cliche, we're talking about herding cats. And there are a whole bunch of individuals that are out there that really want to, be comfortable saying, I'm an atheist. They want to have a little bit of support when their family is giving them a hard time about being an atheist. And these kinds of conferences are all over the place, and big major props to the people who are putting them together. But these conferences actually give people a chance to, sit in the same room, walk the same halls with people who have shed those superstitious beliefs from their childhood, and a way to just kind of talk through whatever issues that they're having with family and friends and co-workers, etc.
Absolutely. And I don't know if this is like super appropriate to say, but I feel like oftentimes people who are atheist but too afraid to talk about it basically go through the same sort of process that people in the LGBT community go through when it comes to facing a stigma or like fearing what sort of repercussions would fall onto them if they were to admit that they were atheist or non-believers or whatever. There was one guy who was talking about being a veteran of the armed forces, and I honestly can empathize with him here that he heard people talking about atheists in a very, very negative way and was almost to a point afraid to talk about his atheism because he felt that he was going to be judged for it or treated differently for it. And I can't say that I necessarily blame him for that because I felt much the same way when I was in.
Yep. And both of us have that experience. And, there are situations where, being in the closet as an atheist is very similar to being in the closet as a homosexual or, having to hide that you are a transgender individual. Now, I will say that there are very different issues that arise for each of these situations.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not
probably, yeah, and probably, I mean, unless your family is just incredibly violent and just like off the handle all the time, I would say that coming out as an atheist is, for the most part, a lot easier than coming out as gay or transgender. But, there are still challenges presented, and this is still a very religious society that we live in. And, conferences like these and people that attend the conferences really help for people who are kind of struggling with that to feel a little bit more comfortable with it and be a little more confident.
Absolutely. And here's looking forward to my next conference.
Well, Skepticon's in November.
Woohoo.
Random verse. Our random verse for today comes from the Quran. It's in Surah 2:10. Here's how it goes. In their hearts is a disease, and Allah increaseth their disease. A painful doom is theirs because they lie.
All right, so before we even get started on this one, this is obviously a case of out-of-context quoting, because I'm sure that there's something surrounding this that makes it probably make slightly more sense.
You want to know what's kind of funny about that?
Am I wrong?
No, when I found this verse, I actually looked for context before and after it, and the Quran is what appears to me to be very poetic rather than narrative, and this surah is almost completely disconnected from the stuff around it. So
weird.
I'm not really sure if there's such a thing as out of context for this verse, but one of the things with this segment is taking verses out of context is often a lot more entertaining than trying to figure out where they fit into a broader story.
All right, fair enough. All right, so my immediate reaction to this is confusion, because as far as I understand the teachings of Quran, Allah is the deity here.
Correct.
And I'm assuming that, well, all right, maybe not so much confusion now that I'm analyzing it a second time, because I feel like maybe if it's talking about people who lie, people who are liars, maybe it's saying that Allah resents them for being liars and thereby increases their poetic disease within their hearts. So maybe I guess this isn't too bad pulled out of context.
Yeah.
I thought that it was just like Allah's general followers all have a disease in their heart and he increases their disease. And I was confused. But I feel like that's probably not what this is.
Yeah. I was just thinking that, this verse was written before we had modern medicine. And so maybe Islam can claim foreknowledge of heart disease.
Oh, dear God. Oof. But in a bad way. Because that means that Allah is amplifying heart disease.
Yeah, kind of. Does that mean that, like, lies and plaque are the same thing?
Oh my gosh. We need to do a medical study now to find out if the risk of heart disease is greater in those who are fibbers.
I think that we should definitely fund a study on that. Are liars more prone to heart disease?
Let's do it.
Okay. Well, I mean, if it can claim foreknowledge of heart disease, it certainly can't claim the cure for it, because this is saying that Allah is increasing their disease. I have absolutely no idea why he would want to increase their disease.
All right. Well, I feel like you're taking this a little bit too literal. If we're talking about how poetic the Quran is, then I feel like it's not necessarily actually talking about heart disease. It might be talking about them just being a piece of shit for lying.
No, but that's what I'm saying. Okay, so let's put aside the heart disease meme for a second.
Just a meme, bro.
And let's just talk about the disease of being a big fat liar, pants on fire.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you could generalize it even further to just being a not good person. But yeah, that also doesn't really make much sense because this is saying that Allah recognizes all of the people who are not good people and he's making them even worse people.
Yeah, well, and what it's saying is he really, really hates it when you lie. And the punishment for that is a painful doom, whatever that's going to be. And knowing that he hates lying and knowing that the punishment for being a big liar is a painful doom, this says that he makes them bigger liars.
Well, maybe that's his way of making their doom even more painful.
You know, I almost wonder, so Allah increaseth their disease. I wonder if this is actually saying that the more that these liars... Ooh, are the liars like skeptics? Is this what he's talking about? Like people who don't believe in Allah don't believe because they're just big liars. And the more they think about Allah, the more skeptical they are. And that makes them bigger liars.
I don't know, but I feel like we're really digging deep into this, and I feel like somewhere out there is somebody who's very familiar with the teachings of the Quran, and they're probably just laughing their butts off because we're making a mockery of this.
I don't know if they're laughing or just being like...
Or face palming.
They're incredibly stupid.
Yeah, they're hardcore face palming is what's actually happening. We apologize to our listeners who have religious studies degrees.
No. Hold on a second. We didn't apologize when we were reading the Book of Mormon or the Bible.
Oh, dear.
Now you're apologizing. Now you're just a Muslim apologist.
All right, fine. I take it back. I don't apologize. Fuck you.
Oh, well, now you're just a bigot.
Well, I mean, they're the ones who chose to educate themselves, and I don't have a degree yet. It's jealousy, is what it is.
So what you're saying is instead of just reading this verse by verse, we should actually study it in depth and seek wisdom and try to understand it.
Yes, what I'm saying is we need to become religious studies majors.
Do you have that kind of time?
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Well, I just wanted to say that this isn't an isolated statement about a God making something worse. And I don't really understand it in the context of how believers feel about their God. So in the Bible, in the Old Testament, God specifically said that he hardened Pharaoh's heart when he had the Israelites in Egypt and made Pharaoh not let them go so that he could visit these plagues upon the entire city and all of its inhabitants. And I never understood that because, first of all, if you're going to make a free will argument, Pharaoh's free will was completely subverted by God. And if you aren't going to make a free will argument, then God chose a path where he hurt, maimed, and even killed hundreds of people just because he wanted to show Pharaoh something.
Well, I mean, I already told you, the Pharaoh was in denial. But... yeah, I think this is something that I kind of struggle with, because if we're... Alright, so, I mean, even backing up to the, like, not even talking about stuff like the whole Garden of Eden and, like, creating Satan and all that other nonsense that if you're an all-powerful good being, it doesn't really make much sense for you to do those sorts of things. This is something that I just can't really wrap my brain around. Like, these all-powerful, good-hearted deities that are just, like, doing some really fucked up shit to their followers that I don't know. I guess from the perspective of the people who are following these religions, it's like, oh, well, they're just testing me and they're trying to make me prove my devotion and faith, which is fine, but that's also kind of fucked up. Like, if that's actually what you believed in. It's like growing up, if your dad was like, you're not allowed to eat tonight unless you go out and beat up 3 people. That's just a really messed up thing to do.
Yeah, it's really messed up. And this is something that I've never understood as well. And it's something that just gets more and more unclear to me. Because usually the explanation for, something like Allah increaseth their disease is, well, Allah, like God, like, any other deity that you can pick, just has his ways, and his ways are above ours, and we'll just never understand.
Yeah.
And that would be a capital T truth.
Fake news. And that's a wrap, folks.
That is a wrap for this week. I hope you've been enjoying this podcast. So now I'm going to ask you not to give us money, but to help us out in a different way. Wherever you get this podcast, it would help us out a great deal if you could rate us and share this podcast with your friends on social networks. Get the word out and help us get a bigger audience. We appreciate you listening, and you can always find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. The title music for this podcast was created by Austin Cologne and used with permission. The Wayward Willis is a media production of Willisware, LLC. All rights reserved.
This has been The Wayward Willis. If you liked what you just heard and you want more of Jon and Logan, you can follow us on Twitter at Wayward Willis, Facebook at facebook.com/The Wayward Willis, or at willisweb.com. If you want to help the show and have a few extra dollars, you can donate per episode or per month on Patreon at patreon.com/wayward. We'll be back next week.